Randy Roig, our treasurer. He will give us a virtual historical and architectural tour of New Orleans, which is finally just reopened, I believe, with live music. So if you're ready, Randy, I'll hand it over to you.
All right. Yes, I am. Hello, everyone. Hello from New Orleans. Hello from Lafayette. So, what? Yeah, can you hear me all right? Yes?
Yep.
Yes, sir.
All right, perfect. Well, what we're going to do is start. I am a licensed tour guide in the city of New Orleans. I volunteer for the Friends of the Cabildo. It's actually harder for me to maintain my tour guiding license than it is my medical license. I have to get drug tested, background checked every 2 years, and I don't know why drug testing. It seems like probably people smoking marijuana might give a better tour. But in any case, we'll go ahead and I'm going to bring you virtually to the French Quarter. And we're going to try to do that right now. Let's see if I can bring you there. And as most of you know, we're here because of the Mississippi River. That was first cited by Europeans in the 1540s when Hernando de Soto discovered the Mississippi River.
Audio, it's good.
Below present-day Memphis. He died near that site and never did see the mouth of the Mississippi River. It wasn't until 1682 when La Salle came down the river in a canoe, and when he reached the mouth of the river, proclaimed that all of the lands drained by the Mississippi River belonged to the King of France, naming it La Louisiana in honor of Louis XIV, the Sun King. La Salle left the area and came back with 4 ships to colonize the area. The problem was when he sailed from France, he was trying to find the river, but unlike many great rivers that end in a grand bay, the Mississippi River fingers out into the Gulf of Mexico. La Salle could not find the river. He wound up landing in Texas, near present-day Matagorda Bay. He spent 3 years searching for the river, never could find it. His men mutinied and murdered him. It wasn't until 1699 that Iberville came from Canada, and he founded a settlement near present-day Biloxi, Mississippi. Some years later, his younger brother, Bienville, considered the father of New Orleans, was canoeing in the river. Bienville was quite the explorer. He knew Native American languages, and he was in the river when he encountered 3 English ships. They were intending to settle here, and Bienville spoke with them and told them that they had to turn around. If they went any further, the French fleet was just beyond the turn in the river and would blast them out of the water. It was a complete bluff. There was no French fleet, but the English took the bluff and left. It was then that Bienville knew he had to find a site on the river. He looked at about 12 to 16 different sites. The first high ground from here is Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Where we are right now is about 100 miles from the Gulf of Mexico, and it's not high ground. So Bienville had to choose among all these different sites, but he chose this one for one obvious reason. Does anybody know what the reason is why he chose this site? He chose this site because of Bayou St. John. It's back in 1718. it was very difficult to sail up the Mississippi River. Remember, there was no steam power. But one could very easily sail into Lake Pontchartrain. And from there, I'll show you this on a slide when I'm doing the Zoom presentation. But it's very easy to sail into Lake Pontchartrain, and from there up Bayou St. John to within 1 mile of this site. And so the whole trick was bringing furs from Canada, porting them at New Orleans, walking them the 1 mile to ocean-going vessels that would then sail into the Gulf of Mexico to the eastern seaboard and then to Europe. So that is why we are here in this spot. The Native Americans had already discovered this trick and had a settlement here at the site of present-day New Orleans. And I'm going to show you that in just a moment as we leave Jackson Square and go to the Mississippi River. Yes? Question?
Why was it so hard to sail up the Mississippi River?
It was very hard to sail up the river because of the strong currents of the river. And as I said, there was no steam power, so it would have taken quite an effort to get miles up river.
Are there currents at Bayou St. John and Lake Pontchartrain?
There are no... Oh, let's turn and look at the ship there. That's just so cool.
Wow.
New Orleans, I just love looking at ships in New Orleans. We're up about 20 feet from street level right here, but if you're on the street, it's one of the few cities in the world where you look up to the river and the ships float above your head. New Orleans is a huge container port, and we are building a new pier that will be able to accommodate Panamax vessels. Let's go and see. So you can see why Bienville chose this spot, because ships trying to sail up the river, that's very hard, but it's very easy to sail into Lake Pontchartrain. And then if you look, there is a natural bayou that led straight into the city, almost to the side of the river. And this is where the French Quarter is, right here. So it was, they actually later built a canal that went all to the French Quarter. And so the whole trick here was bringing furs from Canada, walking them to Bayou St. John onto ocean-going ships. And that went on for quite a long time until the Industrial Canal was built to Lake Pontchartrain in 1920. So let's go ahead and take a look at the river right now. And we'll go back to the video. And I'm just captivated by that ship. In fact, the Mississippi River drains all or part of 32 American states and 2 Canadian provinces. You can see the drainage basin right here. It's really quite enormous. You can see what a claim LaSalle made when he claimed Louisiana for the King of France.
Wow, it even goes into Canada.
Yeah, 2 Canadian provinces. So the Mississippi River defines New Orleans. If you are visiting New Orleans in person, we don't talk about directions in terms of north, south, east, or west. We talk about towards the river or towards the lake or upriver or downriver. So if you ask someone, should I walk north, they'll know you're not from New Orleans. Now, the river is so wide here, it's about 1 mile wide and very deep, about 200 feet deep right here. It's often very difficult to see which way the river is flowing. If I'm looking at it right now and I can't tell which way the river flows, but the river here does.
Why don't we ask?
We could ask, do you know which way the river's flowing?
The river is actually moving this way, but it drains out that way towards the ocean.
Yeah, it looks like it's moving that way, but it's actually flowing that way. At this spot, at the French Quarter, it's flowing due north. And actually, if you look across, there is the west bank, which is actually, right now, we're looking due east towards the West Bank. So you can see north-south, east-west don't mean a lot here in New Orleans. So tourism is very important to our economy, but our lifeblood is the port. And our major products are lumber, rubber, steel, and everyone's favorite, coffee. New Orleans has the largest coffee roasting plant in the world, and it has the United States' oldest coffee processing plant in the United States. All right, here we are at my engineering stop. I was an engineer before I went to medical school, and so I find this one of my favorite stops on the tour. We're going to talk about water management here. Everyone knows a bit about water management since Hurricane Katrina. I often think about Hurricane Katrina. You can hear the cathedral bells in the distance here. I think about Hurricane Katrina often at this spot because I was giving a tour just a couple of days before the hurricane struck. New Orleans has always had a difficult time with water management. Of course, we have the river here. When Europeans arrived, there was already a natural levee at the river. They began improving it immediately, and actually New Orleans has never had a river flood. Well, maybe sort of a little one in the mid-1800s. There was the Sauve Crevasse many miles upriver from New Orleans, and it flooded the back of town, but it didn't cause severe damage to the city. So we've never had a river flood. The big problem with New Orleans was hurricanes and rain. We get about 60 inches of rain per year. And if you think about it, we're surrounded by levees, so what do you do with all of that water? It took a long time to figure that out. And I find it interesting, after Hurricane Katrina, people said, look to Holland or other countries to get ideas about water management. Well, in the 1890s, a gentleman by the name of A. Baldwin Wood invented the screw pump. The screw pump was revolutionary because it could move large amounts of water and debris that's in water. That was always the problem with previous inventions. So when he invented the screw pump, it allowed all of the area of present-day New Orleans to be drained and to remain dry. Those pumps are still in use. They've never been updated. And actually what Holland and other countries use are the screw pumps. There's never been a pump that has improved on his original invention. So what happened in Hurricane Katrina? There's a lot of misconceptions about what happened. People always say when the levees broke. The levees in inner New Orleans actually did fine. It was some interior flood walls on drainage canals that were not built to specification, and those are what failed. That has been corrected, and so we don't anticipate having another Katrina-style event again, thank goodness. Questions about water management? And I have a depiction here of all the pumps with the red dots, and you can see there are, in addition to the levees, I mentioned a flood wall, and you can see a flood wall and a flood gate behind us. And when a hurricane enters the Gulf of Mexico, there are about 120 of these floodgates throughout the city, and we close the floodgates in advance of the hurricane, thus sealing off the city. Okay, we've stopped here just adjacent to Jackson Square at the Pentalba apartment buildings. They're reputed to be the oldest apartment buildings in the United States, but we know that's not true because there's some older row apartments just down Charter Street from here. But nevertheless, they are very old. They were constructed by the Baroness, who has quite an interesting history. And that's what I'd like to tell you about at this stop. She grew up the daughter of a very wealthy New Orleanian Spaniard by the name of Don Almonaster. Don Almonaster was a notary who had very large properties in Louisiana. Notaries did very well under French and Spanish colonial rule because everything had to be. All property transactions were documented in detail, even with colored drawings. So New Orleans has an extremely rich history that is fully documented in living color. Going through our archives is incredible. So, Michaela Almonaster was betrothed in marriage in a very traditional way to a French noble, well, the son of a French noble, the son of the Baron Pentalba. They were married in St. Louis Cathedral and then moved to the Pentalba estate in France. The marriage there was a bit troubled. You see, unlike in English common law, French civil code endowed women with property rights. So all of that Almonaster money that Michaela had was hers, and the Baron Pentalba wanted it. He insisted she sign over the property, and she refused. He banished her to the back of the estate, allowing her to see her children only at dinner time. Still, she refused for the property. In frustration one evening, the Baron Pentalba went to the house where he had banished her with a revolver and demanded that she turn over the money. She still refused, and he shot her. She grabbed her chest. He shot her again 2 more times, blowing off some of her fingers. She fell to the floor in a pool of blood, and knowing he had killed his daughter-in-law and that his son would inherit all of that Almonaster money and the Baron title, he turned the revolver on himself and killed himself. Miraculously, the Baroness survived. How that happened in the 1840s, I don't know, but she did. And she returned to her native New Orleans. And when she got here, she decided to develop a lot of her father's property that surrounded Jackson Square. She transformed the Cabildo and the Presbytere and put mansard roofs on them. She transformed the military parade grounds, which was called the Place d'Armes, into Jackson Square, putting that equestrian statue that we all know in place, and creating something evocative of Paris. She also decided to build these apartment buildings. They were built for the upper middle class. There was retail below and apartments above. She transformed the look of New Orleans by putting these cast iron railings on the verandas. And you can even see, I don't know if you can see in the filming, but the cartouche on the railings has an A and a P for Almonaster Pentalba. These cast iron railings were relatively new. Before that, we had wrought iron, which you beat into shape. It naturally turns black. It does not need to be painted, although sometimes it is for aesthetic purposes. Cast iron, on the other hand, has a different iron carbon content, and that allows it to be poured into molds, into intricate shapes, but it rusts and it must be painted. These are painted brown. New Orleanians loved the Pentalba buildings. They began taking down their wrought iron railings and putting up the beautiful cast iron that we all know today throughout the French Quarter. The Baroness was very successful with this building. She built an identical building across Jackson Square from here. She's a shrewd businesswoman too. I think she paid about $150,000 for this, and she demanded that the architect build the other one for $10,000 less. He skimped on materials, and there was actually a collapse of part of the building because of the inferior construction on the one across the square. After she transformed the look of New Orleans, the Baroness missed Paris. She decided to move back to France, and she built her own chateau in Paris, which I think is just such a beautiful poetic story, because she built this beautiful chateau not far from the Champs-Élysées, and when she died, ultimately it was purchased by the United States government, and it's currently the home of the United States ambassador to France. So if you ever enter high American society and you get invited to the ambassador's residence, you'll be in the Hotel Pontalba. Any questions about the Baroness and her very interesting life? It was made into a book and an opera called Intimate Enemies. You know, she was a very magnanimous woman. When she moved back to France, she took care of her husband, with whom she had been separated until she herself died. These buildings later, there's an interesting story, but ultimately they were purchased by a wealthy New Orleans gentleman and donated to the state of Louisiana and to the city of New Orleans. And part of them are now museums. And otherwise, they're still used as apartments and shops to this day. Let's move on to the next spot. We just mentioned the Cabildo and its mansard roof, which the Baroness Pontalba had constructed. You can also see an example of some of the most intricate wrought iron that was painted green for aesthetic purposes, although, as I mentioned, it would naturally turn black. But a fairly intricate design for wrought iron. Okay, I stop here at the home of another Spanish notary, Don Nunez. Don Nunez lived in this house, which is not incredibly interesting, but the event that occurred there was. Don Nunez was kneeling down at his prie-dieu on Good Friday in prayer, and he lit some prayer candles. They ignited his curtains and started a fire that went on to consume 3/4 of the city of New Orleans. It was quite the fire. You can see a depiction of how it destroyed much of the then constructed French Quarter. The fire started. There was no 911 back then. The thing to do was to ring the cathedral bells, which is just a half block from here. But it was Good Friday, and they were wrapped in muslin. And so by the time they were able to raise the alarm, the fire had spread and it destroyed the city. Just a few years later, we saw that New Orleans had been completely rebuilt, but in 1794, some kids were in a courtyard on Royal Street and started yet another fire that consumed 2/3 of the city. The Spanish officials were horrified at this and said that this could never happen again. And so they enacted some strict building codes. And there were 3 main things that they did. They said that all buildings in the French Quarter had to come directly to the street. Before that, they had front yards and things of that nature. They wanted to create a firewall. Furthermore, all of the buildings had to be covered in stucco. And finally, all the roofs had to be flat to avoid catching embers. The flat roof thing didn't stick around too long, because with 60 inches of rain, a flat roof just doesn't work well. But the other 2 things did stick, and that is what results in the look of the French Quarter that you see today. and all stems from that fire, those fires in 1788 and 1794. I stop here in front of the Louisiana Supreme Court to talk about this building behind us. This building dates late 20th century. And what happened with New Orleans at that time was America had purchased New Orleans. When the Americans moved in, they were mostly from New York. They spoke English. And they didn't mix with the Creole people who were already here. The Creoles spoke French, and they just didn't get along. They had different customs and cultures. The Creoles were Catholic. They tended to not be educated. They liked to party a lot, liked to drink. The Americans tended to be educated, some highly educated. The Americans had a lot of money, the Creoles not so much. So they didn't mix. It's one of the things that makes New Orleans unique. People think of America as a melting pot, but New Orleans, it was not a melting pot. They settled on the other side of Canal Street. As New Orleans grew, the Americans built grander and grander homes towards uptown, up St. Charles Avenue, where the streetcar is. The Creoles did the same thing in the other direction, downriver, and up Esplanade Avenue. What happened was the American sector, the original sector, became our central business district, and the French Quarter, well, it became a slum. By the time of the early 1900s, it became, and no offense to anybody who's Italian or particularly Sicilian, but this French Quarter became a Sicilian slum. And the city leaders decided that they would do what is normally done in the United States when a building or a neighborhood is past its prime. They decided, let's just rip it all down, knock it all down, and build something new. And they drew up plans to do that for the entire French Quarter. And they started it right here with the Supreme Court building. They decided to make a huge civic complex, and they started here. Some people with foresight in New Orleans thought, we're going to lose our incredible heritage here. When this block was torn down, we lost Andrew Jackson's headquarters for the Battle of New Orleans. We lost the original Antoine's restaurant. We lost a whole block of historic buildings. This preservation movement, which was a new thing for the United States, there really was no thought of preservation until this happened in the French Quarter. This preservation movement resulted in what we now call the Vieux Carré Commission. And now you can't change anything so much as a hinge or a shutter or a paint color without consulting them. The oldest preservation district in the United States is in Charleston. It's about 6 months our Vieux Carré Commission, but that preservation movement, it started here in New Orleans, and it started right here at this block. I like this Beaux-Arts building. It's a beautiful building, but I really wish we had those older buildings back. Brief stop just to talk about a few architectural elements, and particularly right behind me is the LaBranche building. It's the second most photographed building in the French Quarter after St. Louis Cathedral. It's known for its cast iron railings that were put up after the Baroness Pentalva did hers. The pattern, and it's just beautiful. Just beyond that are some balconies. And you can even see how people expanded their balconies to make them verandas and then change the railings using cast iron. So what is a balcony and what is a veranda? Well,
I've never heard if he knew.
Hey, do you know the difference between a balcony and a veranda or a gallery? Well, a balcony is the word that people commonly use for all three. A balcony is cantilevered off of a building. There's actually one right above our heads here that you can see. It's a little narrow, and it's a place to hang out. But it's not like an extra room like on the LaBranche building. You could actually put a bed on that. You could put curtains up, and you could use it as an extra room. That's a veranda. And you can see it has posts going to the street to support the very wide veranda. As opposed to a gallery, which is across the street, which you would use to move from room to room in a house. It's a passageway of sorts. So, sometimes these terms can get confusing because sometimes some galleries can function as verandas and some balconies can be used as galleries. So, but you get the idea. Yeah, I'm going to add just one little thing here about the LaBranche building because I think it's sort of fun. The LaBranche family were originally from Germany, and their name was Zweig. Germans were among the earliest to immigrate to this area. Legend has it that when Mr. Zweig emigrated, he met the French immigration officer who said, "Name, please," and he said Zweig, and the French officer's like, "Zweig?" And Mr. Zweig picked a twig and said, "Zweig, Zweig," because it means twig in German. And the French officer said, "Ah, LaBranche." And forevermore, the Zweig family has been known as the LaBranche family. Sort of an interesting illustration of how, although New Orleans was French for only a small time, because French was the language of the household, even though it later became Spanish, and then American, French customs persisted in the Creole area. All right, here we are at one of my favorite stops because here I'm going to teach you all you need to know about New Orleans architecture. You'll be an expert after this. Behind us is the second oldest building in the French Quarter, and it really stands out from all the rest. It predated those fires I mentioned earlier, and it's in the French colonial style. It's one of only two buildings that we have in that style. And you'll notice some unique things about it. Remember, the people who built these, they were from Canada. They were French Canadians. And so they were building their homes, preparing for the tremendous snowfall they knew they would receive. Of course, they never did get that. But they have a steep, hipped roof on the top. The rooms in the house, there were 6 rooms in this upper middle class house. They had no hallways. The rooms were connected to one another by doors. And you'll notice the doors on the front of the house, they're not symmetrical at all. In fact, they don't line up with the rooms at all. And you'll see that it is set back from the street prior to those Spanish codes. Now let's move just a little bit to the left, and we're going to see a Creole townhouse. You'll see that this one was modified by adding a veranda and cast iron railings. The Creole townhouse, like the French colonial, had no hallways and had rooms connected by doors. Now this was a townhome, so it had a retail store down below, and then a porte-cochere or carriageway where that lady just entered. If you were visiting the owners of this home, you would not enter through there. There was no exit at the back. If you were visiting them, you would go through the porte-cochere and ascend the loggia in the rear to the premier etage or the main house of their dwelling. Now, just to the left of the Creole townhome is an American townhome. And always ask at this spot, what is the difference? What do you see in this American townhome? And the answer is you see a front door. That was new to New Orleans with the Americans. And as I was talking about the difference between Creoles and Americans, the Americans had a lot of money, and they wanted a big front door, a fancy one, to show all that money that they had. Americans also valued their privacy a bit more, so they had hallways. So you would have entered the front door, hallway, parlors to the left, and they would have had hallways separating the bedrooms as well, rather than just door to door. Now, we do have a question.
You mentioned how rich these Americans are. Is that why that house is really nicely painted? And the French colonial home, the paint is falling off, the wood is rotting, the railings are about to fall down.
Well, it's funny. The more things change, the more they stay the same. And we're going to get to the difference between Brian and I momentarily. But if we can take a look at the houses behind us, these are Creole cottages. And they're a little more simple. They're smaller. And these are all over the French Quarter. They typically have 2 doors and 2 windows, or 4 doors like the one right there. They have 4 rooms, no hallway. If you were visiting the people who own this Creole cottage, you would not have entered through a front door. You would have gone along the side through an alleyway, because in cottages and Creole townhomes, the life of the home was in the patio in the rear. The front of the house, the street, was sort of nasty back in the 1800s. The roads were not paved. The swamp was just a few blocks away. There were alligators there, snakes. So the life, and crime, the life was in the back, in the patio. So these are Creole cottages. So now you know all of the architectural types, or most of them, that you'll see in the French Quarter. Creole cottage, Creole townhome, American townhome, and then the French colonial structure. Now, I've mentioned this word Creole a lot, and I don't know if any of you know what Creole is. I grew up thinking that Creole means a mix of French and Spanish. Many people feel it's a mix of black and white. But what does the word Creole truly mean? Well, if one looks at the origin of the word, it comes from the Portuguese word criollo, which means firstborn of the colony. And so, when it's applied here in New Orleans, we can see how it was used by looking at census records. And if you were from France and you moved here, you were French. If you were born of the people who moved here, firstborn of the colony, you were Creole. If you were an enslaved person, you were listed as African. If you were born here, you were listed as a Creole slave. So we can see that the word Creole applied to both black and white, French and Spanish. And so what does that word mean today? Well, I think probably the best definition is it is someone who is descended from people who were born here before New Orleans ceased to be a colony, which was when the United States purchased it in 1803. So probably the modern means anyone who is descended from people who were born here before 1803. Now, a lot of people confuse the term Creole with Cajun. And Cajun cuisine has become very popular. And this is my husband, Brian. He's a Cajun, and I'm a Creole. So Cajun culture comes from the people who were expelled from Nova Scotia in the 1700s and settled in southwest Louisiana. It's a rural culture. The food is very different, the people are very different, and it's very separate from New Orleans. Southwest Louisiana, Cajun, New Orleans, Creole. So the foods are very different. When you think of Cajun food, you would think of it's less complex. It's probably a lot hotter, as in peppery. Think cayenne pepper. The classic, lots of rice dishes, maybe corn. A very classic Cajun dish, jambalaya. Creole cooking, very complex. A mix of African, Spanish, French, German, all together. Classic Creole dish, gumbo. So now you know a bit more about Creole and Cajun. This is a very quick stop. I just wanted to show what happens when an American buys a Creole building. This is a Creole building. You can see the porte-cochere on the right. And the American bought it, and what did they say? No front door, we need to fix that. So they put a big Greek revival fancy front door on this Creole building. All right, everybody, no tour of New Orleans would be complete without mentioning jazz. And I stopped at the birthplace of Danny Barker, a famous New Orleans jazz musician. He was, in many ways, like the classic jazz musician of the early 20th century. Like Louis Armstrong, had a successful start in New Orleans and then moved to Chicago, became famous, and then graduated to New York. They say that that jazz was born in New Orleans, grew up in Chicago, and then settled down in New York. Unlike Louis Armstrong, however, Louis Armstrong never wanted to return to the segregated South, and he remained in New York until he died. Danny Barker returned to New Orleans, and when he did, he noticed that things had changed with jazz. It had evolved. And into multiple different music forms. And he wanted to preserve the original jazz, also known as Dixieland jazz. To do that, he helped in the founding of what is now Preservation Hall. If you make it to New Orleans in person, it's right next to Pat O'Brien's, and you can see some of Danny Barker's legacy and hear some original jazz in person. It's quite an experience. All right, here we are in front of the Ursuline Convent. It is the oldest building in New Orleans, and it's like the building we saw previously. It's in the French colonial style. Not only is it the oldest building in New Orleans, but it's the oldest building in the entire Mississippi River Valley. It was started by the Ursuline nuns, who built their original convent just on the other side, closer to the river, in 1727. That building had a poor foundation for the reasons that we discussed earlier. They transported the original staircase from 1727, which has some of the oldest wrought iron in the United States, to this site and built this convent around it. This convent has served as the nuns' home for about 100 years. Eventually, the city leaders decided to cut streets through their property, and they moved downriver from here, establishing a new convent. This building was later used as the palace of the archbishops of New Orleans. The archbishops built a chapel for their own personal use, which you can see right there, which is one of the few alterations the building has had. It later served as home to the Louisiana legislature and many other uses until today it serves as the chancery for the Archdiocese of New Orleans and has a museum that can be visited. You can also rent it out for events. An interesting story about the Ursuline nuns I'll mention, because they did move downriver and remained there until the Industrial Canal was constructed at the beginning of the 20th century. At that point, they moved, that was about 100 years there, and then they moved to uptown New Orleans. And then, about 100 years after that move, Hurricane Katrina flooded their property. We thought, well, it's been 100 years, it's time for the Ursuline nuns to move again. But instead, they renovated their property, and they continue what is the oldest girls' private school in the United States, Ursuline Academy.
All right, everybody. I hope you enjoyed your virtual tour of New Orleans, and I hope that you return to New Orleans in person for the next Southern Pain Society meeting.